Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie. Happy to be here. Social scientist, a little out of my element, but I drink a lot of water. I'm made up of a lot of water. So I guess we have some things in common here. So here we go without further ado. You might be thinking, though, who is this social scientist who works at University of St.Gallen? And no, we don't have STEM subjects. I think like 85% business school, actually. So I'll tell you a little bit about my profile, the work I do as a setup to explaining some of the, I'm talking too loud for this, aren't I? It's like picking up on my accents and everything. Okay. I'm going to have to take my energy down, though, to talk quieter. Okay, here we go. Yes, so it'll give you a bit of an insight into the work that I'll explain, which is coming from economics, from psychology, some of my own work in management. Okay, so you might have noticed from my accent, I'm not from around here. So I'm originally from the US, but actually my 7 times great-grandfather, Heini Brach, is from Aargau, from, Bozen in 1790. So anyone Aargau, right? Yeah. We could be cousins, right? So, so I'm a little bit Swiss too, but I started at Wake Forest University in North Carolina, working my way to Yale, working in social psychology. So how do we think about other people? How do we form judgments about them if we want to be friends with those people? I researched kids as well, which is still applicable to my work in organizations, I think, because as you might have seen yourself, right? Sometimes our coworkers act like children, right? But during my PhD at the University of Zurich, I had a SNF fellowship in Australia, in Singapore. So I've got a bit of international experience there. Worked as a postdoc at TUM, and then have been at University of St.Gallen actually for the last few years with this SNF professorship. So as a psychologist looking at organizational phenomena such as leadership, I use this kind of micro lens of how do we judge others, think about others, view others, how does that shape our actions and evaluations of those people? Can I make this farther away? Yeah. Can you still hear me? All right, here we go. So I study things like humor, right? People are usually surprised by that, but it's a lot of fun. So if you have questions about diversity and humor, that often comes up because people are like, "Oh, I feel like I can't even joke anymore," and so we can unpack that together because that's not true. Humor has so many positive benefits about bringing people together, about relieving stress. Of course, you are all smart people if you're working here at Eawag, right? So you know not to go there with, I don't know, religious jokes, sexist jokes, right? You're smart enough to come up with more clever jokes than that. But I also look at leadership and in teams, right? So diversity within those groups, who's a leader of those groups. I'll unpack one of those studies with you today, looking at work-family conflict. Yeah, raise your hand if you have a family member, like a child maybe, yeah, a baby, yeah. Fur babies, yeah. Yeah, okay. Some people with pets out there too. All right. And then also even at the firm level. So we would call this macro management. We also call it the micro foundations of sustainability, looking at men and women leaders and how narcissistic they are, and if that influences how sustainable in terms of environmental performance their firms are. So using this kind of lens to look at diversity in many different ways at different parts of organizations. I don't just do research, even though I do a whole lot of it and I really enjoy it. My partner is Swiss, so he is the reason, in addition to my loving cheese and chocolate and the quality of life here, why I did make the leap over the pond 12 years ago. My child, Pete, he's a little older than this now. Does anyone know where this was taken? Swiss people, this is a stereotype, but you know, like all the mountain peaks. This is from Gurte in Bern. If you haven't been there, nice music festival, nice place for kids too. I play trumpet, run, and play volleyball as well. So, all right, we're ready to go into the meat. Okay, no, there's a lot of vegetarians now, so we're going into the core of the presentation now, right? Who's seen something like this? Yeah? Who knows what this is? Just shout it out. Yes, percentage of women. Yeah, leaky pipeline, it's often referred to, right? I show it with just one of the lines here because, if it's a percentage, it's implied that the other one is going up. But I think this is also kind of a more inclusive way to show it, right? Then it's men and women that kind of reinforces this idea of gender as a binary, which we know it goes beyond two categories. What's something else that you notice about it? So if we start at 32 and we end with 13, it's decreased. Yeah, it's gone down. I know we're starting with really baby steps here because I'm not sure how many people have more or less experience with this. We will get more technical and detailed as we go on, right? So the main idea of these leaky pipelines, which are pretty consistent across various areas of my field, so business and economics, of physics, of many STEM disciplines, even in psychology, where you have an overwhelming share of women who start in the bachelor's, 70% in many cases. You still have only about 20, 30% women professors at the start, right? And you might notice something here in the middle, right? In between that kind of PhD assistant professor phase, the gap or the leak is, as it's often called, is especially big, especially drippy. I don't know, you're water people. Do you have a better word for this? Right? And a lot of research points to the idea of family formation, right? Because when we think of professors or of leaders in organizations, because again, those kind of look very similar, how many women, men, and people who identify in other ways start and then end up in the highest levels of those organizations, very, very similar, right? It's especially leaky here because our ideas of these fields of leaders, of professors is often very committed, devoted to the work, right? We would say like agentic, so go-getters, confident. And when you think of family formation, especially for women, the stereotypes and kind of prototypical words that you often think of are not like that, right? It's often caring, other oriented, right? Maybe not as committed because there are suddenly, small humans who are dependent on you for survival. And given the way that even still today, families tend to divide care work at home, still women contribute the lion's share. Men are contributing more than they have in recent decades, but it's still, especially they call it like the third shift work of, birthday presents and organizing all the things, right? The kind of invisible work, still often the lion's share goes to women. Yeah. So that's why it's especially drippy in this middle phase. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. So I like to use this as well in thinking of a metaphor of some reasons why there might be especially more women leaving, being pushed out, dripping out, men staying, being pulled in. There's various kind of words and metaphors and explanations for this. In these discussions, I want to always emphasize that you do want to hire people who are qualified, right? It's not about shifting to hire, less qualified people just because of their identity, but identifying a lot of those biases that we have that all of us, men, women, people who identify as in other categories, right, are exposed to on a daily basis, right? Since we're tiny children, right? They've done studies on kids and they'll go for all sorts of toys and all sorts of colors. But then especially when they start school and get a lot of reinforcement from their peers and from teachers and things, from marketing, right? They start to kind of sort themselves into women or girls and pink, right? And boys and like blue. And if you look at the clothing even, right? Just look at the clothing that is for boys and girls, especially in the US is very prominent. All the clothes are predators. For boys, it's like sharks and T-Rex. And then for girls, it's all actually the prey. It's kind of scary, right? It's the owls and the bunny rabbits, the things that get eaten by those other ones, right? So it comes in many different ways, some unconscious, some more conscious, right? Coming from many different actors, even from parents. There's really rigorous studies from economics showing that once families have a child who is a girl and a boy, they actually spend more time with the same gender parent and will pursue more gender congruent occupations and then also parent their kids in more gender congruent ways. right? So all sorts of actors here, we're not placing blame, right? We're just trying to understand that this is very complex. There's a lot of signals and reasons why kind of all of us are exposed to these messages that like boys, masculinity is like this, girls, femininity is like this. Yeah. And those are what we would call biases. Yeah, because it usually tends towards one direction or the other, right? When you think of brilliance, right? There's studies on this too, especially in teaching evaluations, for example, that men are more associated with the ideas of brilliance that's shown in Nobel Prizes, right? You really got to convince them, even if a woman is a first author of the Nobel Prize winning paper, that, you know, she must have had some brilliance on there too, right? But bias isn't always negative. I want to make that comment as well. So when we're talking about various biases, there's also something called homophily. Raise your hand. Anybody heard of this? Homophily, similarity attraction? No? I mean, it's exactly how people choose pets as well, right? So they've shown that, for example, people and their dogs often look very similar because you like them more. They kind of remind you of you. It's a little narcissistic, but we're the same way with other people, right? You have a slate of potential candidates, right? Many are very qualified, right? But you like this one a little more, right? Because they you know, are from somewhere near where you grew up, or they also play volleyball like you do, or they love your same soccer team because you noticed that they were wearing a shirt, right? Or mentioned going to a game. So it can come in various ways, but we have a pull towards people who are similar to us, and that is often even stronger than the push away from people who are ostensibly dissimilar from us, if that makes sense. Yeah. So when we talk about bias, it's pulls and pushes towards people who seem to be like us and not like us. Yeah. All right. So now that we have some of that covered, we're going to talk about some proactive strategies based on some of these. We'll go through 3 key areas that touch various parts of research, because I was trying to think what might be relevant for you. So we'll talk about co-authorship, yeah, attributing credit for producing scientific knowledge. Yeah, papers are important for us, yeah, even in business. And then we'll talk about leadership, right? So whether you're talking about group leaders, professors are also a sort of leadership role, deanship, presidencies, right? All of that is very relevant here. And then talk about incivility, microaggressions. That's kind of the stuff that happens in between, yeah? But first, I am a professor, and I want to get us all on the same page here to make sure we have a common understanding of some of the key vocabulary often used in this space. So if you can go to Menti quickly. See most people's eyes now? Yeah? All right, so what is diversity? We always talk about these DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Do we know what we're talking about? Well, okay. There's a clear trend towards option C, right? But let's unpack this. So a term to describe different demographic categories. I think that's what people often think. And if you Google it, you might get a definition like that. Minority or marginalized members, I think, again, that's what people often think about if they read news articles and things like this. But we're scholars here, right? And so if you actually look in the literature, it's about the differences and similarities, and it's always in reference to some sort of group, right? So that's also a key part of this definition. A single person cannot be diverse. And yes, I know that's the like 3rd gender category in the German language, but when we're talking about diversity, right, it's in reference to something. So you have a share or a percentage of women in a group, or of people who identify as Black, right, or African in a group, right? So it's always in reference to something. Next. I think you can already guess what the next one is going to be. Yeah? You should all see this now. Equity. Yeah, so I don't see many people selecting the last one, the value of shares issued by a company. If we were at St.Gallen, we would see this, right? Equity of a firm. That is a definition of a different understanding of equity, all right? Fair and just treatment, yes, that kind of gets the gist. But as the first one, the longer one was correct here. So ensuring people receive the same resources, rewards, and opportunities regardless of background or identity. That would be a more technical one. If you read, for example, a recent HBR piece, though, by one of my colleagues, Enrica Ruggs, because some HR groups are eliminating equity because sometimes equity implies that you have to redistribute resources a bit, right? The fair and just also includes this dynamic component, right? So that's kind of a easier way. So that's basically to say that one is wrong. This one is, yeah, partially right. But I guess I would say this one is actually the most right, actually. Yeah. And equity is a tricky one because people often mix it up with equality. And here in Europe, especially, it's usually an equal opportunities office. So I think people have this second idea more in mind, right? So the same resources and opportunities, right? That's equal. That's more equal than equitable. Next, what do you think it's going to be? Yeah. All right. And this is the last one. 8. Pretty clear trend here as well. If you answered this one, correct. This is the Lisa Nishi understanding of it. So she's from more of an HR perspective. So fairly implemented employment practices that kind of goes in the direction of equity that we talked about before. Integrating differences, right? So making sure that people of different backgrounds, maybe a diverse group of people, have a seat at the table and involvement in decision making. So they also have a say at the table. Yeah? Equity, seat at the table, and a say at the table. Equal opportunities for diverse persons. You just heard me talk about how it's not always about equal. The act or state of being included. That is what Google might tell you. I think that's even how I got it. But you never want to pick the definition that has the term in it, right? Right? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for humoring me there. I hope that gives us some vocabulary so that we're all on the same page in discussing some of these topics and key pieces of research about diversity, equity, and inclusion at work. All right, so now we'll talk about taking credit, right? Attributing credit for work, leadership, and these microaggressions, incivility. So this is a piece in economics from Heather Sarsons, and in many fields, yours as well, I think, right? You have many authors, yeah, on papers oftentimes, because it's collaborative work done in labs. Who's done work with many authors? Do we got like 10? Raise your hand if you've got 10 at least on a paper. Keep it up if you've got 13, 14, 15, 50. Anyone 50 or more? You're the last one. How many you got? About 50. All right. Okay. I win then. I think I have one with 212, but it's a many labs project. So we were like 100 groups across the world doing a project. Yeah, anyways. Okay. Very cool. So it's safe to say that work is often done with many collaborators, right? Could be men and women, could be higher and lower status people in the hierarchy, right? Professors, PhD students. And what Heather noticed is that when she had work with other people, and she was even in hiring committees, right? When women had worked with more senior, often male co-authors, because economics is very heavily male. I think something like 80% in most cases of full professors are still men. She noticed that people were attributing, oh yeah, that's co-authored though. I think he really pulled the weight on that one. Do we know? I mean, credit statements, I think, are helping in clarifying who does what role in the various paper. First authorship, last authorship signals various things. In economics, it's just alphabetical. Yeah, it's just in alphabetical order. So she solo authored this paper so that no one else could take away her credit for doing this, to look at the fraction of solo authored papers and how long it took to get tenure. Yeah, so this isn't all their papers, it's just how many are solo authored. And what do you notice about this graph? It's pretty darn flat for men, right? So the fraction of solo author papers made no difference on them getting tenure, but for women it did, right? A significant positive trend here, such that the more solo authored papers that women published, the less likely people could attribute that to her other co-authors, right? Especially when there were men. They did follow-up analyses looking at the gender of the co-authors, right? Such that when they did more solo authored papers, they were getting tenure quicker. Yeah. And this is really, really robust data. In economics, they do many causality checks and whatnot. So I think this is an important one to show for those reasons of being very rigorous, but also because we do a lot of publishing in our field, right? And so if someone is presenting a work, for example, that they've co-authored, or you're on a committee and things are getting discussed about co-authored work, right? Just take care that you know about this effect now, right? So look at those credit statements, take that extra 10 seconds to look at that. If they're live, right, ask them what they did. That might be a chance for them to clarify what they've done. Or you realize, oh, they don't even know what was done in that paper. I don't think they did anything, right? So it can be helpful either way. All right, here's one of my papers. Raise your hand if you are a leader in some way. Maybe you have direct reports that are research assistants, you have a group that responds to you, you have a formal leadership role, HR capacity, yeah? All right, many people, yes? If you don't now, you might in the future as well. And the main argument we wanted to make here, there's a lot of research on, for example, experiments where men and women do like the same behaviors, but they're either perceived differently, rated differently, right? So what we did here is it's in the field. So we had actual leaders leading actual groups, and we just manipulated if it was a male or a female leader, because we had 50% of each, right? And we trained them how to be leaders. And then we also manipulated the share of men and women in the teams. Yeah, so it was either male dominated, so 70% men. This was in business and economics, so that's a totally common thing to happen, or more balanced. So it was 50 to 60% men and women, yeah? So you get the design so far? Men and women leaders and more balanced or male teams. Yeah, and the basic idea we wanted to say here is that leaders do not exist only in some kind of vacuum, right? They're viewed as extensions of their team. So instead of doing anything to the women or the men leaders, telling the men to act less, masculine, agentic, like confident, overconfident in many cases, right? Or telling the women to do more of that, right? To try to close this gap in the perceptions or ratings. All we did was change the team that they were leading, right? And by doing this as an experiment or randomization, there were no other differences, right, in those teams. So if there were any differences in how those leaders were rated, it was because of the team, yeah? All right, so what we found was that, so you see your male leaders here and female leaders there, and their prototypicality. So how leader-like is this person? Because that is correlated with so many other things, how effective those people are as leaders. We looked at also trust in the leaders, so really important outcome in terms of performance and motivation of the people in those teams, right? And we found that it didn't really matter whether it was these gender balanced teams or male majority teams. The male leaders were rated pretty highly on prototypicality. But for women, when they had their male majority teams, they were rated significantly worse, right? Because they were not viewed as being representative of that team. Most of the team was men. This is a woman. No, this is not a prototypical leader, yeah? But when they led a balanced team, they were rated as equally prototypical, and the teams had an equal amount of trust. Again, we're not trying to create an advantage for women. We're just trying to level the playing field here. And we did that without doing anything in the actual leaders' behaviors, simply the context around them, the teams that they lead. Yeah? Any questions? Yeah, in the back. No, because again, this was business and economics and informatics. And so that is already male majority. So we didn't have as many women to, for example, make those groups female majority, because I think we only had 35 teams each time. So in terms of statistical power, we chose these two as the most interesting and informative for theory and practice to advise that. I wouldn't even know what to predict if we made female majority groups, because that would be kind of atypical for that context. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, of course. So the question was if we had any female majority teams. Yeah. And the paper's published. If you're curious about any other things that we did, the robustness checks, right? Please check that out. All right, finally. This has actually come up a few times today in just chatting with people. Yeah, have you heard of microaggressions, incivility, interpersonal discrimination, subtle discrimination? It goes by many terms. I put this picture with it because this is what GPT thinks is death by 1,000 paper cuts. Yeah, yeah, we're laughing. It's kind of funny, but it's right. A paper cut is very small, but darn, that thing hurts, right? And it hurts for a while. And that's the point with oftentimes incivility, microaggressions. It's something small, right? You heard, they did great for a woman, right? Is a common one you all often hear. And maybe even the person thinks that they're complimenting that person, right? But then the person who received that goes back and says, hold on, what? Like, they should have just stopped with that was really great, right? But for a woman, it's like, am I, are they biased or am I doing something wrong, right? So it's this idea of sense making afterwards because it adds this ambiguity about, hold on, what did they mean and why did they say that, right? That distracts these people from doing the work that they should be doing or doing whatever else, not making sense of this weird, ambiguous sort of situation. So the scientist in me wants to define it, right? If you're talking about incivility, microaggressions are a similar concept, slightly different definition, but for all purposes here, I lump them together. Low intensity, ambiguous acts of potential disrespect, often interpersonal. So it just happens something we say to someone else. Yeah? All right, I'll give you some examples of this. Oh, that was supposed to be on this. Hold on. Oh, I'm giving away the, I don't know what happened to the slides here, but some examples of this from research from Ali Meister, for example, here at IMD in Switzerland. Sometimes you're trying to say something and you're talked over, or you want to speak up, and it's often the older men or higher up men who just don't even look at you. It's like you're not there. Yeah, this is coming from people in a business context, but I think it often happens in academia as well. Someone else was talking about a microaggression. When you bring up biases in interactions to someone, they say, oh, you're just being sensitive. It's like, I've written them down. I have objective proof, right? It's not sensitive, it's observant, right? And then another one said, I had 2 PIs. One of them already told me to be less confident and less intense. So imagine having to give a big presentation, maybe a dissertation defense, and you're like, hold on, I got to present the results and be accurate and describe them well and be charismatic, but like not too intense, right? It's adding things that don't need to be there. It's totally unnecessary, right? So even this last one, I include it because the person might have been trying to be helpful here, right? But in the end, is that helpful? No. Say something much more specific, more constructive, right? That can be done in a slightly different way to deliver the same message. Yeah, okay, so close your eyes because I'm going to go back to where we should be right now. All right. So incivility. So I just wanted to make a few comments here to note that, yes, it is low intensity, ambiguous, but it's very prevalent, very common, right? And research shows, including some of mine in academia here in Switzerland, right, showed that women report experiencing this more often than men in academia, right? And we did that across different fields. So if you were in Swiss academia like 8 years ago, you might be in that study, right? And so imagine if one group is getting these subtle signals, right, that you don't really belong or like you're not doing this right, right? You eventually feel like you don't really belong as well, right? It can kind of add up and make a mountain out of a molehill, right? Too many paper cuts, and that really hurts, that really stings in the end, right? And so those are some key factors that we showed in our research and others kind of are pointing to now with more work, that it's one of the reasons for the leak in the pipeline, right? So even though they're very small, it's just words, but we know words hurt too, right? All right. So I do want to comment that there's other things that people often talk about now, talking about like parental leave policies, other sorts of political things. I hope you voted recently. I think there's another one coming up soon, right? Pay equity is pretty big topic now that a lot of people don't realize is there. I don't talk about those, but there's some resources at the end that I'll point you if you're interested in that. What I do want to spend a bit more time on is, who knows what these are? You're really confused how these are related, aren't you? These are various Barbies. And so what we're going to talk about, right, is one of the letters in DEI. You often see belonging as the B. I want to add A to this. This is work that I'm doing led by my PhD student, Eugenia Bajet Mestre. Allyship is similar to sponsorship, to mentorship, but it has an informed component. So this knowledge part really makes it different. Right, that last quote I showed you about like not being intense, right? That was maybe coming from a mentor trying to be helpful. But if that person knew about the types of feedback that men and women usually receive, right? Which women's feedback, they've done quite a few studies looking at like performance reviews now, millions of performance reviews. And women's feedback is much more vague, less actionable, and less constructive than men's, right? So it's like, okay, I got this, now what can I do with it, right? They might have been able to rephrase that feedback to be more constructive, helpful, useful, right? And then the number 2 and 3 that distinguishes allyship from mentorship, where mentorship can often be like, we're chatting, I give you some advice, right? We meet, we have coffee, right? There's some communication and some action, right? So if you want to call it sponsorship or maybe advocacy, to kind of put it in the umbrella of these other terms that you might have heard of. All right. And allyship, I think, is very important because instead of individuals, especially instead of fixing individual women, which often we see is the case, right? Our work is collaborative. We just talked about how many co-authors are often on papers, how many of you are leaders of teams, right? Of people who work together. So the idea is that we can be allies for other people in our networks, in our context, in our various roles as academics, yeah? Any questions before we dive into what those actions are? Okay. Now to make the link to Barbie, it's a great movie with an awesome soundtrack if you haven't seen it yet, broke many records, but the idea is that allyship can take on many different forms depending on the situation and the person, right? So just like you have a Barbie for every occasion, you can have an act of allyship for every occasion. Okay, so we talked about those. So if you see or hear, for example, some of that feedback, right, those quotes that we went through as microaggressions, or we've actually delivered allyship training for men in Switzerland as part of this, right? It was an open executive education program, we call it at St.Gallen. And a common example that they often come up with of, you know, an opportunity for male allyship is that they say when there's meetings, it's almost always the most junior person in the room who is almost always also a woman who takes the notes every time, right? So why would that be problematic? You can't really contribute to the conversation if you're focused on writing down what other people are saying, right? And then if you're doing that, you're kind of being assigned a lower status role. So people will see you more as a secretary. Maybe it is the secretary, right? But especially if you're equals, right? You're kind of getting downgraded with that, in addition to not being able to actively contribute, right? And there's so many cool AI tools now, right? Otter that can, you know, take those notes for you. So you don't even need a person doing it. But I just say that because that might be an example that you can think of, that you see where you can act as an ally and rotate that office housework, right? Or even volunteer if you see someone else is often getting assigned that role. But in general, the types of behaviors we can use to be effective allies, we call them the 5 Ds, right? So maybe it's distraction. If it's live in the moment, and for example, this has happened before, the president of the university comes and is talking in German to everyone and keeps saying, Professor, 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 right? I know enough German that that's the masculine form, right? Never use the inclusive form, the plural form, not even the feminine, right? So after the 3rd time or whatever, someone in the front row went, ouch, right? So that would be a direct kind of distracting, so that maybe blends both of them, way to assess that, right? The person's giving a presentation. You don't want to raise your hand and say, excuse me, that's the wrong term, right? Because that makes the person look bad, you know, that changes the whole. You could do that if it was really intentional, but oftentimes with some of these instances, right, it's not intentional. It's just that they don't realize, or that's how it's always been done, right? And norms are updating as we learn more about some of these things, right? So that's a good example, I think, of maybe a direct distraction that doesn't cause defensiveness. Another D, right? Sometimes documenting, right? So especially that quote that we looked at, where the colleague said, "Oh, you're just being sensitive," right? No. You can write down these things when they happen, write down the comments. And after a few, right, pattern is kind of indicative, like, okay, now maybe we say something once or twice. If it's not so bad, you maybe let it slide. Maybe they're busy or whatever it is, right? Maybe they didn't know the right words. But after a few times, right, maybe then you say something and you have your kind of evidence to show you're not just sensitive, right? You have what happened. Delegate. Maybe you're not always the right person to do this. Maybe you know, I think this might be sensitive for them, but maybe their colleague who I know better could say this. So I'm just going to say like, hey, I realize that so-and-so keeps interrupting, especially maybe women or junior people in the meeting. Can you just maybe bring this up, right? You don't have to do all the allyship. You can also engage other people to allyship chain, so to speak, yeah? Maybe even delay, so it doesn't have to be in the moment, it can be afterwards, right? Because again, we're not here to, evaluate people, judge people, put them on the spot, make them feel bad, right? I think just like in academia, we're here with open minds, we're trying to learn and grow, right? So you can just come afterwards like, hey, I heard you mention this thing, I don't know if you realize, but it can come off like this. Maybe try this next time. So one-on-one, after the fact, right? Potential learning opportunity. Yeah. All right. Did I get all of them there? Yes. Delegate can also be, I know HR is in the room, and that's like last case, right? Most of these acts, especially incivility and microaggressions, are very minor and I think can be handled with micro interventions, right? But if it happens time after time again, you want to maybe proactively avoid some of these things we've been hearing about happening at ETH recently. So you can potentially escalate. That would be part, I think, of the delegate, but only when necessary. Yeah, again, we really want to keep an open mind, come at this at colleagues, I think, in most cases, and maybe use the distraction, delay after the fact, one-on-one. Yeah. Any questions about any of these? Again. Yeah. So direct could also be saying something in the moment. So you're in a hiring committee meeting and someone said, I just didn't believe their data when they were talking about that. And you can directly counteract that and say like, oh, can you be more specific, right? Because we often see, just like women tend to get on average less actionable, concrete feedback as men, right? This could be an example of that, right? They're criticizing without something more specific. Maybe they just didn't like the topic, right, that they were looking at. And I've seen this in some, right? So if that comment is made, especially at the beginning of a evaluation, right, it tends to spiral and affect the next comments that are made, right? So kind of a direct comment could be exactly like that. It's just, oh, can you explain what you mean? Or tell me more, or how is that different than the others, right? So sometimes just taking a beat to think more about it, or to highlight like, hey, I don't really believe what you're saying. Can you provide more evidence? Sometimes that's enough. Did that answer your question? So in thinking about your toolbox, it got loud again. In thinking about your toolbox of skills, of competences, of experiences that you've had in academia that you take with you as scholars, as team members, as co-authors, as team leaders, whatever hat you want to wear, you can be allies, right? And I didn't even unpack this a lot, but like I do want to mention quickly before we sum up is that when people usually speak up about their own experiences of bias, they often face reactions like in one of those quotes, right? Like, oh, you're just being too sensitive, or oh, just toughen up. This is how academia is, right? Stuff like that, right? So when, for example, there's several studies, especially on women speaking up about bias towards women, and the research shows that they're viewed as complainers, overly sensitive. And you can imagine if those perceptions are there, is that going to be an effective intervention? No, people aren't going to take it credibly, right, and as a legitimate issue. But if an ally, especially a male ally or someone who has higher status, maybe it's, a leadership role in that group, right? Maybe it's something like that, because, that status is very dynamic. They have a better chance of both calling that out and doing something effective about it than the person who experienced it. Yeah. Okay. So in thinking about your toolbox of things that you can do, allyship is one of them. I hope you can go forward and at least know what this is. Another letter in the DEI alphabet, so to say. It's all about action. I did want to include just a few. I tried to be broad already in the things that you could do as allies in interpersonal ways to kind of identify and combat microaggressions and incivility. But in thinking about the research, that those three key areas that we talked about, right? Credit can help to maybe reduce some of this attribution bias, suppressing your positive bias towards people who are like you. I think that also applies here. It's research by Axton Lay. They studied many different kinds of potential interventions, like suppressing negative bias, which of course that doesn't work. If you're not thinking about the elephant, you're only thinking about the elephant. Yeah, but suppressing positive bias actually is more effective, and simply taking more time was also one that was pretty effective in reducing bias in evaluations. Here, the Fix the Game, Not the Dame paper that we mentioned, right, is just thinking about not only the gender of the person, but the diversity of the team that's evaluating them, if you can do that, or even just simply making more gender balanced teams. That would also make a more equal playing field in those teams' evaluations of leaders, right? So those are important things for even class evaluations, right? Because a teacher is also kind of a leader of the class. And then finally with microaggressions, right? Awareness, I think, is important. What are these things? Why are they harmful? What can we do about them? So think about your 5 Ds. I think it's important to know ahead of time some things that you can do in the situation, because otherwise, if you're like me, you walk away and you're like, darn it, I should have said something, but I didn't know what to say in the moment, right? So for example, even if you're giving a presentation, and we know that on average, women get more direct and aggressive questions than men do in conferences. This is again from economics. You could just drop your pen or pencil on the ground, pick it up, and that gives you a few more seconds just to think of something to say, right? So that would also be a D, a distraction mechanism. Or you could take water. I take water just because I'm thirsty, but that could work too. All right, and then again, actions to be allies for others. I want to make sure we have time for you to ask questions here. This is kind of reviewing some of the things that we already talked about, right? But as well, thinking about networks, because that's so important. In academia, everyone says, oh, it's about publications. But that's not always the case, especially in making the leap into associate, full, endowed professorships, right? Who do you know and who knows you is very important. And because of these homophily biases, right, positive biases towards people who are like us, and because a lot of these areas are very male-dominated, right, statistically, those men are kind of locked into these networks, and women are often locked out. So just make sure if you see some talented people, right, share information. Hey, I saw this thing that might be interesting for you. Or hey, some of us are going out for drinks at the conference. Would you like to join, right? We're going to karaoke. Come with us, whatever it is. Make some of those connections, especially if you're a higher status person in power. Amplify voices and talents in meetings. This could also just be like introverted people, right? So that's also an area of diversity that we often forget, a deep level area of diversity like extroversion and introversion. Introverts may not contribute as much in meetings, right? Because extroverts are talking more, or the leader is talking more, or they want to think more before they contribute, right? So you can make it explicit that they have time, or ask them what they think, yeah, or tell them before the meeting so that they have some time to prepare that you're going to ask them for their thoughts. Interrupt microaggressions and defend others as well if necessary. Some other actions. If you're involved in recruitment, raise your hand.
If you're recruiting, hiring, evaluating, promoting, quite a few hands. All right. Yeah. So structured interviews, step one, right? Have the same set of questions that you're asking people so that you have the same information to compare, right? You can redesign CVs. This is our new nature human behavior piece, right? Because a lot of people have gaps in their CVs. Could be because they took care of family, could be because COVID, they were unemployed for a while, or maybe they got long COVID, right? So those gaps actually make it especially hard to get back into organizations, but especially if they're short, have a very small effect, if any, on the person's ability, commitment, motivation to do the job, right? So redesigning the CVs or how you ask for that information in your tool, right, in your recruitment tool. Again, an HR thing that you can do to reduce bias. If you want more information, that's on in Nature Human Behavior. A longer shortlist. Anybody heard of this? This is also a different piece by some colleagues in Nature Human Behavior. If you're thinking about people who could be good for a role, the first 10 or so people you often think of tend to align with gender, racial stereotypes. But if you just persist 3 to 5 more names, those lists get more diverse, right? And we've seen a lot of universities, for example, doing this, and businesses like proactively reaching out to people, right, with this in mind to ensure that they have a more diverse slate of people to then potentially invite to interview and hire. And like I said, from the Axton Lay paper, take more time for really critical decisions and try to reduce positive bias. Okay. Rotating office housework, that's like taking notes in the meetings that I mentioned. Networking, make different kinds of events, right? Not always drinking. Not always soccer related, although everybody or many people do enjoy, myself included, right? AM, BAM, all good fun. And work design, make sure the important meetings are within work hours, the core work hours. I think Michael Hengarner did that really well when he was my president at Zurich in making that a policy throughout the university. But just to close and make sure you have some time, so I just want to reiterate the idea that it's not us versus them. It's not a fight, right? I think in general, inclusion benefits everyone, right? If you have a seat at the table, a say at the table, and equitable policies, right? It enhances the ability for teams to reach their potential, yeah? And given that a lot of what we do, especially the high impact work that we do, on what we call grand challenges. So this includes climate change, inequality, all of these things that are very huge and systematic and systemic and everywhere persisting, right? It takes collaborative work to do that. And so if you want to go fast, you can go alone, of course, but if you want to go far, you go together. And that includes diverse people going together in an inclusive and equitable way. So thank you for your attention. Any questions?